Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the ATBC virtual meeting day 2 and to the panel discussion on ecological, economic, and social dimensions of tropical restoration, lessons and opportunities. I am Robin Chasden and one of your moderators today. And I will be introducing the other moderator is Jaburi Gazul. I am a part-time research professor with the Tropical Forest and People Research Center at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, and Professor Emerita in biology, ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Connecticut. And I have been working with tropical forest regeneration and forest and landscape restoration and ecosystem services provided by forests for many years. We have a stellar panel for you today, and we will introduce ourselves now and the panel theme, and then we'll introduce each panelist to present a brief talk and followed by questions afterward.
I'm Jaburi Ghazul. I'm co-chairing this, co-moderating this panel with Robin. I hold the chair of ecosystem management at ETH in Zurich, in Switzerland, which I've held since 2005. And I also have a part-time position since 2018 at the University of Edinburgh as the director for the Centre for Sustainable Forests and Landscapes. By way of introduction to this panel, we all know that COVID has been a real shock to the global system. And I sincerely hope that none of you have been seriously affected by COVID. But this shock has really distracted from our political and social attentions away from the environmental challenges that we face, particularly those of climate change, biodiversity loss, land degradation. So now that we're slowly coming out of this COVID challenge, it's time, I think, to really renew our focus and efforts once more in addressing some of these environmental challenges, which frankly in the long term will have far more consequential human and global impacts on well-being. So unlike COVID, we have yet really to fully understand the full complexity of these environmental challenges and how to begin to address them. There are solutions, of course, but these solutions are often partial. They're always contested, and they invariably lead to unforeseen outcomes or unanticipated outcomes. Some of these solutions, though, do exist, and we have ideas to work on, and prominent among which is forest and landscape restoration, which is the theme of today's panel and discussion. The questions might be, how will we implement forest and landscape restoration? Or perhaps we should be asking a different question, slightly different. How should we be delivering forest and landscape restoration? Implementation needs to recognize that many stakeholders, there are many stakeholders, and that these stakeholders have a huge multiplicity of views and value systems relating to landscapes. Strategies should be negotiated, and they should be negotiated across often competing interests. So we should take account of distributional justice concerns, recognizing pretty much in every case that there will be winners and losers in any scenario, and that the power to determine outcomes is certainly not equally distributed. Trade-offs and conflicts need to be considered, and they need to be mediated as well. Communities need to be an active part in the design and implementation of forest and landscape restoration strategies. And these communities will expect to have continued access to viable and attractive livelihood opportunities. So all of this needs to be enabled by appropriate policy frameworks and governance systems and scaled up through substantive public and private financing. So forest and landscape restoration is certainly not just about ecology and the natural environment, very much about the political environment and the social and economic environment as well. There are a diverse array of forest and landscape restoration projects already across the globe, led by individuals, communities, even businesses and governments. And if implemented well, they can bring real, substantial and tangible benefits to people, even within a few years. But success is not guaranteed. We've already seen conflicts. Some of these conflicts have even been violent in this arena. And so what we're going to do in this panel is explore some of these challenges. Over to you, Robin.
Our panel discussion will explore many of these opportunities and challenges by drawing on many case studies that our panelists are familiar with and reflecting the inter and transdisciplinary nature of forest and landscape restoration. We can't cover all of the aspects in one session, but so we will provide food for thought on the urgent need to frame environmental challenges through a diversity of disciplinary and normative perspectives. And we ask you to contribute your questions as we go through to broaden the discussion. The panelists will illustrate examples of forest and landscape restoration challenges, benefits, and outcomes. And before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to remind you to submit any questions that you have throughout this session using your Q&A tab. The questions will be read and addressed at the end of the presentations during a particular Q&A session at the end. And please indicate who you are asking the question to, or if it applies to all of the panelists. I'm happy to present our first speaker, Pedro Brancaleon. Pedro is an associate professor at the Department of Forest Sciences at the University of Sao Paulo, and he's the vice coordinator of the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact. And he is affiliated with a member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. He has published over 170 peer-reviewed papers, and he coordinates large research and technology projects financed by a variety of different donor organizations and funding organizations. He is very much a generalist, focused on developing cost-effective solutions to conserve and restore tropical forests, based on an interdisciplinary approach and co-production of knowledge with multiple stakeholders. Over to you, Pedro.
Thank you, Robin, for the introduction. For me, it's a great pleasure to participate in this panel with some of my academic heroes and recent collaborators like Antoine and Susan in other initiatives. So I will share my screen and start my presentation. So I imagine you can see it, right? Yeah, so in this presentation, I will bring some overview on my impressions on the major challenges and opportunities we have for promoting large-scale tropical restoration. And as you know, the demand for tropical restoration has never been so high. So we have many commitments, and it seems that the world has developed a kind of sense of restoration emergency. So people wants to find a quick and large fix to reduce the loss of natural capital worldwide. So for the first time in my career, I have the impression that the demand for restoration interventions is higher than our capacity to deliver them. So many people like myself and others have prepared for this moment for the past few years. And it seems that finally this moment has arrived. So that's the time for large-scale restoration. Many people want large-scale restoration, and it's time to develop the right approach and solution for enable this movement. But at the same time, we have this huge demand for restoration. We still have most of our restoration approaches based on a kind of plot or tree-based mindset. So many restoration approaches has been developed for addressing specific solutions at the plot scale, or they have been focused in the number of trees planted, but not at the major drivers of land use change or forest persistence. So in many cases, these restoration approaches has been developed for the context of biodiversity offsetting policies, in which the restoration is a kind of punishment, and no matter how costly it is, the companies will have to do it. Or in terms of charity, so rich people giving money to poor people planting the beautiful trees, and it works in some case to get some beautiful photos or to have a good forest plot, but not to resolve the main drivers of degradation and forest cover loss. So we have to address the root causes of deforestation, and this is the main challenge we have to enable reforestation in the future. So I think that we have to develop novel alternative restoration approaches. For me, this is part of the core solutions we have to address. So some general questions we have to consider is how to reduce costs, how to provide revenues, how to transform restoration into a financially viable land use that could outcompete degrading land use, how we could make a good use of people's knowledge, experience, impressions and experiences, how we can integrate restoration into existing land use, and more recently, how we can use existing technology to revolutionize our practices. So just to give you some few examples of how I have tried to address some of these issues in my own research. So I have here examples of applied nucleation. So we are implementing large-scale experiments, more than 50 hectares, and monitor them with remote sensing, combining eucalypts with native tree species for offsetting restoration costs, using cattle to foster natural regeneration in savanna areas of Brazil. So adapting agricultural machines to do direct seeding of native trees, or even developing a web-based system for registering restoration projects, and to, as we have here in Brazil, a national system for rural registry. And now, for the first time, we can really plan restoration at the country scale. At the same time, we have information at the farm level. So I think that the main ideas I have followed is like to explore the controversies. They are good. Let's find ways to address these controversies, navigate the trade-offs, and innovate. We cannot be afraid of failing when we try to resolve some of these major questions. So all of these alternative restoration approaches, they are important for presenting a broad menu to decision makers. That's what we need today. We have a diverse menu of options that can have higher chances to address the specific demands of different stakeholders. So by expanding the options of this menu, we increase the chances of addressing the preferences of these knowledge demands. So we can make restoration more palatable to these people if we integrate restoration into their existing activities. And more recently, I have worked also with remote sensing. There are many very interesting and revolutionary approaches of remote sensing to restoration, which includes LiDAR remote sensing, hyperspectral images, machine learning. So for me, this will also provide a kind of revolution in the way we plan, implement, and monitor tropical restoration. So all of these remote sensing approaches have enabled us to have a much better and efficient management of natural regeneration. So we can track natural regeneration process in terms of area and quality over space and time at an unprecedented way. So I think that we may soon have new applications of these technologies to restoration, and this may change the way restoration is implemented across the tropics. So thank you very much for your attention. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm open for questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. That was fantastic. Thanks, and a lot of the work you're doing, I know, is really exciting. And I know a lot of people will know of your work, if not directly, certainly indirectly. I'd like to quickly move on to introduce Susan Chomba, who's going to be our next speaker. Susan is Director of Vital Landscapes at the World Resources Institute and is currently leading the institution's work on forest, food, and people, which includes forest landscape restoration, as well as sustainable agriculture, food systems, and thriving rural livelihoods in Africa. She's a social scientist with many years, I think over 15 years of research and development experience in Africa. She previously led, among other things, the Regreening Africa program at C4 and ICRAF, and their primary objective was to restore degraded lands in Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya, Somalia, as well as work she's been doing in Niger, Mali, Senegal, Ghana, and West Africa. Susan has extensive experience, clearly, in Africa, having worked in more than 20 countries, not only in East and West Africa, but also Southern Africa. I'm sure she knows Africa far better than probably anybody else in this panel, or even perhaps even in the audience. She was named one of the Global Landscape Forum's 16 Women Restoring the Earth in 2021. And also in 2021, she was appointed as the UN High-Level Global Ambassador for the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience. She's on the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UN Food Systems Summit. So without any further ado, I think I need to hand over to Susan. Really looking forward to your talk, Susan. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this phenomenal webinar. So I'd just like to discuss today about decolonizing restoration. And before I go to the aspect of decolonizing restoration, perhaps just to give us perspective that we are talking about more than 294 million people living in and around areas that are considered as having potential for restoration in the global south. And this therefore means there's a prerequisite for successful and just processes and outcomes in terms of biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, but also addressing some of those livelihood needs and poverty-related goals. So if you're looking really at the big question is not about whether we need to include local communities or to consider aspects of how communities can be engaged, it's the question of how. And so I'd just like to perhaps take us a little bit, in terms of the history and where we are in terms of the setting the agenda for restoration. And we see currently Western notions of why restoration should happen dominate, the restoration discourse. So you must have seen the aspect about natural climate solutions. So restoration provides an opportunity for natural climate solutions, including estimates in terms of how much carbon can be sequestered through restoration. And this view has been, obviously discussed in terms of the risk that it presents, in terms of overestimating the potential for solving the climate crisis that is rooted in the history of fossil fuel industry. And so really looking at that discourse between what is proposed as what restoration can be able to offer vis-a-vis the history of the problem. I think that's very important when you look at the colonial history of it and how we can be able to decolonize restoration. Secondly is the simplistic notion of trees as carbon sinks. And that Pedro mentioned a little bit in terms of that kind of very simplistic narrative around trees, around plot level focus, and not really looking into an ecosystem as a complex, ecosystem that stores, carbon, but also releases it, but also in terms of an ecosystem that provides a wide variety of ecosystem services for local communities and for biodiversity. And so this work that I'm presenting, which is part of a book chapter that we are writing, really argues that this strong global attention on climate change and biodiversity, coupled by a push by actors or institutions who have traditionally been involved in protected area management with its history and baggage of colonialism, really makes the perspectives of local people and their involvement either to be overlooked or sometimes to be seen as necessary trade-offs in the process of achieving the key goals of climate change and biodiversity. So I try to look at how we can use a decolonial environmental justice framework towards decolonizing restoration. And just in terms of background is that decoloniality focuses really on power and politics and the aspects of epistemology, that's the knowledge systems, ontology, that's ways of knowing the world, and cosmology, that's the theories about the world, to look at different aspects of development, including, for now, we are focusing on restoration. There's a very strong focus around subordination and marginalization of local people and their knowledge systems through imposition of what has been called Eurocentric, and I'd like to call it more like even Western kind of worldviews, which are seen as universal. So the way we see the world is really dictated on Eurocentric kind of views of world, instead of looking also at other worldviews. So an example I'd like to bring here is the Western notions of property rights and how that plays into the process of restoration. So if you look at property rights, the ownership process, and I come from a country, Kenya, where land ownership is a big thing. And especially when you look at it since the colonial times, pre-colonial times, land ownership amongst local communities was significantly different from what we call now the private and a kind of land ownership that dictates if one person holds a parcel of land, the other person cannot claim ownership to it. And we've seen a strong push towards aspects of tenure clarity, ownership as a prerequisite for successful restoration. And what we are seeing is that when you look at that, and especially from indigenous perspectives, land ownership and property is not part of indigenous knowledge systems, cosmologies, and value systems, according to which land and forest are in itself and not an object to be owned. And therefore, indigenous societies see themselves as part and parcel of nature and not nature as something to be owned. So to be just in the eyes of communities, and especially for indigenous groups, it's important to examine these notions and to realize that restoration efforts need to be built on their conceptions and worldviews around well-being and their relations to nature. So just a little bit of elaboration here on the environmental justice and especially the aspect of decoloniality. It really emanates from Nancy Fraser's work in 1995, which tried to look at aspects of bringing equity as well as justice through three key aspects. That's the procedural justice, that's the procedures that people are involved in terms of decision-making, recognition justice, recognizing different groups and different communities and their worldviews, as well as distribution justice, that's distribution of cost as well as benefits. And then Nancy Fraser also added the aspect of political representation, especially when looking at a democratic decentralization of natural resources. Now, when you look at that, decoloniality goes a little bit further and says it's not just about procedural justice. It's not just about involving people in decision-making, perhaps in decision-making that they did not determine. It's an aspect of really ensuring that the process ensures self-governing authority. So for instance, where you have local institutions such as local chieftainship, local governance institutions, there's the aspect of self-governing in addition to procedural justice. And secondly, it's going beyond recognition. And again, recognition, it's not just about recognizing that there are men and women, there are indigenous groups that need to be involved, but the aspect of epistemic justice and self-determination. So people can decide to be part or not to be part of restoration process, and it is okay. It doesn't have to be coerced. They don't have to be coerced. It is about self-determination. And the last one is aspect of beyond distribution of nature as property that can be owned, as I mentioned, to a breakdown. We need to break down that dualism between humans and nature and to understand that humans are part and parcel of nature. So to conclude, I want to just highlight some of the 7 key steps that we mentioned in terms of towards decolonizing restoration, trying to be helpful for actors who are already in this space. Co-creating the meaning and objectives of restoration is going to be critical with indigenous groups, with local communities and other stakeholders. Ensuring the voices, needs and interests of the different groups are heard, and not just are heard, but also taken equally in terms of determining the restoration processes and outcomes. Ensuring traditional or indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge are part of the process, but that scientific knowledge is not used to legitimize a traditional knowledge, that those two knowledge systems are recognized as equal and as providing equal kind of inputs into the restoration process. Then understanding the full range of land degradation drivers, and not a simplistic focus either on population that we've seen on Africa. The population is growing And so, land degradation is going to be a great factor, but looking at a holistic kind of drivers, including, drivers that are underlying drivers, processes of extraction that are leading degradation of landscapes. Beyond distribution on environmental benefits, again, to the point that I've mentioned, to embracing the dualism between human and nature. And perhaps just to drive this point home, there's nothing else, that COVID has really shown us as human beings, is this our interconnectedness with nature. People who have got more aspect to be able to go out, even during these lockdowns, they've had better health, better mental and physical health than people who don't have that opportunity. So we need to break down that dualism. And last but not least is when you're actually implementing restoration, is to understand that the necessary policies and institutions that will be supporting restoration, including what I mentioned about land and tree tenure, need to be contextualized. You need to understand the context and the groups that we are dealing with. So perhaps I'll stop there and hope to really engage in terms of questions and discussions. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you, Susan. You've given us a whole new way of thinking about restoration. So thank you so much. And we're looking forward to questions. So now I'd like to turn to our third speaker and introduce Fengwan Hua. Fengwan is a conservation ecologist at Peking University in China. Her research aims to aid the conservation and restoration of forest biodiversity by studying how human alterations of forest ecosystems influence the ecology of wild species, and examining what opportunities exist to alleviate negative impacts and make biodiversity gains. Her work uses a combination of fieldwork and desktop analysis on a variety of organisms, including birds and arthropods. Before she joined Peking University as an assistant professor in 2019, Fengwan received her PhD from the University of Florida and was a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University and the University of Cambridge. So it's all yours, Fengwan.
Thank you very much, Robin, for your introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this panel. So for my slot, I would like to share some thoughts on the conservation opportunity offered by tropical forest restoration through 2 case studies. But before that, I think it is worth highlighting that the conservation potential of tropical forest restoration hinges on restoring the right type of tree cover. Often that means restoring bona fide native forest ecosystems that support high levels of native biodiversity. However, in places where other conservation threats exist, the biodiversity outcome of forest restoration would depend just as much on tackling these threats. Some of the familiar culprits include invasive species and increasingly the overexploitation of wild species, with illegal wildlife trade driving devastating trapping and hunting of wild populations. So my first case study pertains to how wild bird trapping may be undermining the conservation outcome of tropical forest restoration in Southeast Asia. Hutan Harapan, or Harapan rainforest in Sumatra, is one of Indonesia's first ecosystem restoration concessions, shown by the yellow dot here on the map, protecting and restoring a vast area of post-logging lowland rainforest since about 15 years ago. However, there are indications that this period also coincided with a considerable increase in trapping pressure of forest birds, driven by the pet bird trade. So is bird trapping undermining the conservation benefit of forest restoration in Harapan? To answer this question, our team conducted 2 bird community surveys across Hutan Harapan over a period of almost 10 years. Assuming site accessibility, meaning the distance from the nearest road or river, represented the pressure of bird trapping, we designed our survey sampling to cover separate gradients in forest condition and site accessibility. This allowed us to tease apart the influence of forest recovery and trapping pressure on bird species abundance. Using analytical methods that controlled for the observer effect, we found the good news that over the past 10 years, the bird community in general has seen an encouraging recovery in species abundance. Here, each bar on the graph shows the abundance change over time of a given species. The bad news, however, is that the negative effect of trapping on species abundance, here represented by the positive value of beta 2, had intensified over time. This intensifying signature of trapping translated into a dampening effect on the abundance recovery of species across the community, shown here as the difference between the actual current abundance and a counterfactual abundance had the effect of trapping not intensified. In sum, this case study demonstrates that to ensure the biodiversity benefits of expensive tropical forest restoration, it is just as important as habitat restoration to tackle the other conservation challenges. In this sense, conservation and restoration measures really must go hand in hand. My next case study is on the enabling mechanism for biodiversity benefits under forest restoration, specifically as a co-benefit of other, potentially more important policy goals. An ongoing debate in forest restoration is the tension between tree plantations versus restoring native forests, with plantations dominating the current global reforestation agenda. This debate is in part linked to the motivation of reforestation to deliver critical ecosystem services, particularly carbon storage, soil erosion control, and water provisioning. Many such reforestation initiatives have focused on establishing plantations with an implicit assumption that plantations are as effective as native forests in delivering these ecosystem services. But as ecological evidence has increasingly shown, the biodiversity benefit of plantations is very limited. In this context, how to place biodiversity back on the decision map of reforestation? Without challenging the ecosystem service goals of reforestation, an important solution to this question is an understanding of the synergies and trade-offs between the ecosystem service goals and biodiversity in terms of the extent to which they can benefit from plantations versus native forests. However, thus far, this kind of assessment based on paired data has not been conducted. To fill this gap, we conducted a global synthesis of paired data to compare the relative performance of plantations versus native forests. To our best ability, we compiled data on 4 metrics: above ground biomass, the amount of eroded soil, water yield, and species-specific abundance. We first compared plantations versus what we call native forest benchmarks, meaning native forests that had not been previously deforested and therefore could serve as benchmark conditions toward which reforestation could aspire. These include old growth forests and forests that may have been degraded to some extent. Our compiled data had reasonable global coverage. The bubble size in the map indicates the amount of data pairs contributed by each study site. Analysis indicated that the 3 ecosystem services synergized with biodiversity in being delivered more by native forests than by plantations. Now, given the reforestation context, we next asked how well plantations performed relative to restored native forests of similar age. In this case, restored native forests included mainly secondary forests from natural regeneration, but also actively restored native forests via the planting of a diverse mix of native trees. The data we have are much less available for this comparison, but existing data indicated synergies between soil erosion control and biodiversity in stronger performances by restored native forests over plantations. The data for water yield are too few to allow analysis. But for carbon storage, plantations and restored native forests exhibited very similar performances. So put together, these analyses indicate that the 3 ecosystem services that frequently drive plantation-style reforestation are also actually delivered better by native forests than by plantations. So this synergy with biodiversity indicates clear co-benefit opportunities for biodiversity, even when reforestation may be primarily focused on ecosystem services via the restoration of native forests. So here are my 2 cents pertaining to the avenues of ensuring biodiversity gains under forest restoration. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Over back to you, Robin and Jaburi.
Thanks very much, Fang Yuan. That was really fantastic. And all 3 speakers have really covered a broad range of topics. What I'd like to do now is open up the questions. I see we've got some questions already coming in through the question and answer panel. And we'll get to those in just a minute. But I want to start with a question both to you, Fang Yuan, but also it's relevant to Susan as well, and perhaps also to Pedro. The question is, restoration, as we've seen in all 3 talks, is interpreted in different ways. There are different options, different strategies, be it plantations or agroforestry or natural forest recovery. There are different ways of interpreting what's suitable for as interpreted by local communities and what is needed. So my question is, how should we deal collectively And how should we approach the inevitable conflicts that are likely to arise when we're dealing with restoration for various benefits, including, for example, dealing with hunting and trapping that is commonly practiced by rural communities, as you demonstrated in Hutan Harapan, or different normative systems or belief systems, as Susan was talking about. So Fang Yuan, maybe you can start and then followed by Susan.
Okay, so thank you, Jabari. I'll give it a try. I think in the case study that I presented, the issue we're facing really is a conservation issue as much as a restoration issue. And the issue is about the trapping of wild birds by the local communities. Now, I think there are several, I guess, aspects or parcels to this problem. So I guess, I mean, wildlife trade is an issue that has been getting increasing attention, right? So we have for the chain of wildlife trade as a whole system, we have parcels like the demand side from the market, the buyers. We have the linkages in between the demand side and the supply side, which is maybe from the local communities in the forest. And then on the supply side, typically it's local communities catching these birds, but again, they're being driven by the market demand. So I think it's really a complex system to solve. Now, if I maybe talk a little bit about the supply side, meaning the local communities, in this particular system that I have a little bit of experience with, I think there's several challenges we have to face or solve as a conservation community. The one thing is about, I guess, the patrol system, given that hunting and trapping of the birds is actually illegal in Indonesia. So it's really about law enforcement trying to come up with effective strategies of combating this kind of illegal behavior. Now, there may be more efficient ways of doing and designing the patrol programs than the others. But I think equally importantly, as Susan has so powerfully pointed out, it's a matter of social equity to not ignore local communities' benefits and well-being. In this case, while the communities may be driven by commercial interests, nonetheless, it's a source of livelihood for them. For a program to effectively address this kind of threat, I think it's just as important to consider and tackle options like alternative livelihoods of the communities to make sure that it's feasible for them to even convince them or somehow persuade them to go shy away from this kind of illegal behavior. And on the other hand, it's also not bringing detrimental effects on the well-being of communities. I guess that's my 2 cents for now. Maybe over to you, Susan, for some more insights.
Yeah, so I think those are excellent points, Yuan. And just what I'd like to add is the aspect of contextualizing decisions and interventions. So for instance, whereas we tend to use the word communities broadly to refer to local communities, you will all be very familiar with indigenous groups and the role in nature conservation, And so when you're working in places where you have indigenous groups who are protected and interacted with the environments for many, many years, the dynamics there will be totally different. Now, there are other areas, and especially, I've worked in contexts where you have local communities as well who are extremely dependent on forest resources. And so their livelihoods, even though that you may not, you may not categorize them as people who are necessarily, indigenous groups who are living and interacting with the forest. There could be areas where you have local communities who do get their sources of livelihood from the forest, but also are involved in terms of marketing and selling them. And so one of the key things that we have learned in terms of the history of participatory forest management and participatory processes of conservation is really to understand this kind of dynamics and to ensure that we are distinguishing between livelihood dynamics and what is being used in terms of especially illegal activities. So it's not necessarily one and the same thing. You'll find that some of the illegal extraction of biodiversity, or even in terms of trees or birds and other kind of species, some of it that is driven by markets is really not necessarily going to benefit the local economy. It's illegal activities that sometimes even is engaging a whole network of actors, right from, as you mentioned, from the demand side, and sometimes international networks of extractions. And so that's very, very different from when you're talking about local livelihood dynamics. And so for me, to answer your question, one of the things is obviously distinguishing these things when we are designing or we are co-designing interventions, but also ensuring that participatory engagement of local communities who really understand these dynamics more than even external agents who are coming to try and design them is extremely critical. Last but not least is to aspect of landscape. So when you're trying to look at the aspects of trade-offs in terms of balancing different kind of ecosystem services, it's good to have a landscape level, because sometimes when communities do need to extract, for instance, firewood, food from the forest, there will be areas which can be designated as use, areas for forest for use. And if communities have been dependent on whether it's wildlife or whether it's trees and fruits and nuts, as long as those areas are designated for use and there are proper management structures that can enable and ensure sustainability, that is a more likely scenario for communities to then engage. And then you can have areas that are protected for broader goals that don't necessarily have to have huge extraction of these kind of resources.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those answers. We have a question for Pedro here. And others can also chime in. Given that the large scale restoration that you talked about should be based on a menu of options and should also engage multiple stakeholder groups, what is the best process for decision-making regarding how and where to implement restoration in a multiple use landscape?
Yeah, that's a complex question, because I think the first issue is to understand who is involved in the process, because restoration is not an end goal by itself. It's a means to achieve different objectives, and these different objectives can benefit different groups of people. So I think the first step is to understand the socio-ecological context of the territory or the landscape where restoration will be performed. And by doing so, we have to understand how different people they perceive, they benefit, or they are affected by restoration. And then we can more effectively design restoration approaches that better address, the local situations, but also people objectives. So I think that co-production of restoration design is a critical step towards, having a more effective restoration. As Susan mentioned, it's quite common to have this kind of external demand for restoration interventions. So most of the funding comes from people that knows quite clearly their objectives, and most of them wants climate change mitigation. But when this flow of decisions reach the local farmers or the local communities, sometimes they don't care about carbon sequestration. They want water, they want soil protection, they want livelihoods benefits. And then we have to find ways to harmonize these different demands while also taking advantage of this global and international support of restoration. That's challenging, but I believe there are ways to address it in the practice.
Thank you, Pedro. We have a lot of questions coming in on the question and answer, so I'm going to go through, I'm going to group these because some of them are quite similar, and I'm going to ask the panelists to be as brief as possible without being too brief, so that they are also being informative and responding to the questions. So I'll let you handle that complexity. So the first, this is 3 or 4 questions coming in to Susan, which are all fairly similar. One from Daniel, which is, do you think that working with rural communities alone can reach the scale that's needed? Would working with subnational governments to better engage in restoration efforts also help to decolonize restoration while reaching the scale? And there's a broadly similar question from Mark Sycorn, which is about, in order to ensure the rights of local people, they often need to be translated into national level legal frameworks, which are often based on colonial models of land ownership. So how do we preserve principles of local people while interfacing with existing institutions that are not designed to incorporate them? And again, similarly from Xavier, is it possible, or how do we engage economic and political stakeholders at national and international levels to implement decolonization steps that you mentioned. So a group of broadly similar questions. Susan, if you can be brief, but also informative.
All great questions. So I'll start in terms of, local communities vis-a-vis subnational governments. I don't think it's an issue of either or, because obviously subnational governments are governments that are supposed to be, quite working, literally locally with local communities at the local level. So first of all, local communities, first of all, they have to be at the forefront of restoration, because we've seen other models of conservation or of top-down approaches that haven't prioritized local communities, and the evidence is there in literature, in practice. These efforts haven't gone very far. Now, I remember, if Robin still has the question, we've been discussing back and forth in terms of successful restoration opportunities that have engaged local communities. I like to give with practical examples. For instance, in the case of Shinyanga region in Tanzania, or Dodoma region, if you've heard about Hifadhi Mazingira, Hifadhi Ardhi, Shinyanga, the Hashi project. This is one of those programs which, yes, was externally funded, yes, did engage the subnational government, in this case, the district governments of Shinyanga and Dodoma districts in Tanzania, but also really recognize that the sustainability of restoration was going to be based on local communities. And so it revived the Ngitili system, which is a traditional land management system that really looked at how communities can not just manage land, but also plan. We talk of land use planning as if it's something that is so foreign to local communities, just because we come with some technologies and mapping stuff and we think, oh, these guys have never heard of it. Look at the Ngitili system, traditional structures of management of land use planning, where you have areas that were reserved for different kind of land uses. And when this was integrated within an externally funded program, working together with subnational governments, in this case, district governments, we can see the results up to date. So I think the thing is, I want to answer with that kind of an example, that it is possible to combine those different levels and different kind of actors. I'd like to touch just a little bit on the question of policy, because I think that's a very, and it's because it is a challenging question for me continuously when we are working. Yes, we do want to engage communities, and we say policies and institutions are important, but we are working within institution and policy frameworks that are colonially informed, that haven't changed much since they were formulated. And so what I'd like to say is we need to decolonize those policies. It may not happen overnight, but we need to decolonize policies, we need to decolonize our institutions, and we need to look at processes that can be able to embed a community engagement and empower communities, and recognize that that is the sustainable model that we can be able to embrace. So I think without overdoing, let me stop there, and I can try to answer the other questions as well in the chat, in the Q&A here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the answers. This is a question from Antonio Crespo, and I'll direct it first to Feng Wan, but then Pedro and Susan, you may want to comment. This has to do with how do we train the people, the scientists and the practitioners to really do restoration better, to achieve this balance between what restoration can offer and what the demand is. How do we create the right kind of understanding among the practitioners and as well as the scientists to reach this goal?
That's quite a complex and challenging question. I will try. So the question is about the balance between, as in meeting the in the middle way, right? The things on offer and the demand. I think one of the key issues for me in terms of, I guess, achieving restoration is trying to understand where the stakeholders stand in terms of their needs, and trying to see it, and also for and this includes very stakeholders, including local communities, but also policymakers and possibly societal demands. And let's say for a particular goal, and to see whether that may actually be achievable and meets everybody middle way. I guess that's my general answer to it. And in terms of another issue I would like to flag or mention is to really try to understand what the restoration kind of benefits what benefits restoration would bring to the local communities and how that matches with what they want on the ground. So I guess that's my 2 cents for now. I would like to hear maybe more from Pedro and Susan on this.
Yeah, just a short note. I have worked with capacity building, restoration, and developing different approaches. And one of the things that I miss in scientific terms is to have more controlled experiments and pilot sites. So many people, they have general assumptions about restoration methods, and they make decisions that are not always based on evidence. So I've seen that having these pilot sites, controlled experiments in really test how different restoration methods work in different socio-ecological contexts. I think it's crucial. I think we need a much better evidence base to support decision making in restoration, and this is part of the capacity building process of people.
Great, thank you. Again, I want to try to tick off some of these questions because there are lots of them. We're not going to cover all of them, unfortunately, but I'll try to get as many in as possible. Here's one for Pedro from Sean. The problem he faces with large menus in a restaurant is that sometimes the larger the menu, the more difficult the choice. So if you're offering a menu of options, restoration options, is there a risk that policymakers and conservationists and landowners, perhaps, or land managers might struggle with that choice? And I'm going to add to that a little bit more, a little bit of my own question as well. When you do offer these choices, is there a risk that the choices that are taken do not necessarily align well with the kind of societal needs? So do the individual and the societal needs conflict sometimes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really enjoy this analogy of a restaurant and restoration program. And the same way for restaurant, I think we need to specialize at restaurants. So if we have a client that like vegetarian food, we have to offer that specific set of options to this group. And this is particularly important because today I can tell you that the restoration menu has very few options. And the main option is a dish that is quite expensive and not always effective, which is tree planting. So we basically are offering a kind of meal that is expensive and most people cannot afford to pay for it. And even if they do, the results may not be exactly the ones we expected to obtain. So at the same time, all of this complexity is part of decision making in complex socio-ecological systems. So I think as ecologists, we have developed in the past restoration approaches focused almost exclusively in ecological outcomes. But when we try, to use these approaches for addressing people's needs, then we have a problem. We have to merge these ecological objectives with livelihoods objectives, improving agriculture, farming, cattle ranching, and so on, and use restoration as a tool to transform land use and not as a completely different land use apart for everything that people do in their lands. So we need integration of people, of restoration approaches, of land use.
Thanks. And I've got a question here. It's from several people who asked about how do we bring the complexity of what we're talking about really to happen within ecological restoration into governance and public policy arena? How do we actually influence government officials to take on some of these challenges, and which is often going against the status quo? So that's directed first to Susan.
Thank you, Robin. So one of the key ways that I think we need to do business differently, and has been a mission for me just when I finished my PhD, because I started wondering, do I want to go into the academic way? Do I want to go to development, and where do I lie? And when I realized, what I realized is that, of course, there's very, very good research that is continuously conducted, really, really excellent research that can be able to inform policymakers, that can be able to inform development programs. But there's that gap because we tend to do, science tends to happen, and really the processes of those interacting between policy processes and implementation processes become very, very minimal. So we need to bridge that gap, if you ask me. For policymakers, of course, we think that once we write policy briefs, then the policy process will happen by its own. But the thing is, we need a continuous and what we call perhaps research within development. So whatever research that we are conducting needs to be informed by real development or conservation questions for this matter. And we have a clear pathway of really feeding into the policy process. And this is where it gets quite interesting, because obviously policy formulation and engaging with policymakers, as you will all know, it's quite a political process, it's quite a dynamic process, it's quite complex, and it's time consuming. But if we want the kind of fantastic findings and research that we are doing to be able to inform policy, we have to be prepared to have that. So what I'd say is really moving to the last mile of our research, the last mile of our engagements, of really looking at how we can have more structured engagement with policy actors, not in a one-off, not in a one conference where we present our findings, but for instance, in the places that we are working, in the landscapes that we are working, they understand what research we are conducting, they contribute to it, they understand what kind of findings we provide and how they can be able to actualize it. So if our findings need to be able to inform and to be able to be taken up by policymakers and to engage with them to see that that's happening. I'm afraid I don't have a better answer than that, but I think that's the closest we need to start moving to that level of engagement with policy actors.
Well, thanks so much.
Susan. Sorry, Robin, go ahead.
No, I think we're going to wrap up now. We just have a couple more minutes left in the session. So Jabori and I will give a few impressions to try to round this out. I would just like to mention a few key things that hit me during the session. One is this idea about making restoration more palatable, basically making it something that we want to engage in and that really has very clear benefits for all of the people involved, and presenting a menu of choices so that it's not only one thing we can do. And then also from, that was mostly from Pedro's contribution. From Susan, the idea that we need to adopt other worldviews and not impose our Western conceptions of humans and nature, especially the duality between human and nature on a restoration, particularly when we're dealing with indigenous peoples, indigenous cultures. And that nature is not something to be owned. And that's a hugely important point. And then some of the things that Fang Wan mentioned about the need to address the conservation threats when we're doing restoration, that conservation and restoration go together and they need to be accomplished as a joint effort, and that may involve law enforcement. And then finally, there's the importance of co-production of restoration design with the local communities. So Jabori, your impressions.
Thanks, Robin. I think you've covered pretty much everything. There are several other questions which would be great to cover. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to cover everything, and maybe the panelists can provide answers in writing. The only thing I would add is I think there's one common thread running through all talks, and that is the idea that in the end, restoration, it's a normative process. It's based upon values, and those values may differ across different interests, but across different belief systems as well. Belief systems underpin values. We need to be very aware of different belief systems, different value systems, and work constructively across these systems to be able to implement restoration in a manner that's appropriate, both locally as well as for globally. So thanks very much to all the panelists. I think it's been a fantastic session. We could talk for a lot more, I'm sure of that. And sorry for those people who we weren't able to address your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.